Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're heading down to South Africa.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah, and we're going to tackle a big question. Does South Africa have a totally unique architectural style, like something born from its own cultures? Or has it been more shaped by outside influences?
That's a fascinating question. I'm ready to dig in.
Me too. And to help us, we've got this super interesting academic dissertation to unpack.
Okay, and what's the dissertation all about?
Well, it focuses specifically on how tribal culture has influenced modern architecture in South Africa. Oh, and get this, it was actually submitted in Zimbabwe, not South Africa.
Whoa, hold on. Submitted in Zimbabwe. That's kind of strange, isn't it? Makes you wonder if they have a different view of things, from outside of South Africa.
Right. What's their perspective on South African architecture? Super interesting. Okay, so just for context, this research was done after apartheid ended back in 1994.
So we're looking at a time of rebuilding and redefining identity. Makes sense.
Exactly. It was all about figuring out what it meant to be South African, after such a huge shift.
Totally. And the dissertation starts by laying the groundwork, looking at the traditional architecture of 5 major South African tribes. We're talking Sotho, Venda, Xhosa, Zulu, and Ndebele.
5 distinct cultures with their own unique ways of building. That's got to be a lot to cover.
It is. But it's so cool to see how each tribe developed their own features. Like the Venda people, they often built their homes in this really unique shape. Imagine an ice cream cone sitting on top of a cylinder. That's basically it.
Wow, that's pretty unique.
Yeah, and they would also incorporate veranda posts that run all around their homes, creating these awesome spaces for people to hang out.
Oh, and what about the Xhosa? I was reading about their houses. They sounded so cool.
The white-faced houses?
Yes, that's them. Why were they called that?
So they would whitewash their homes, and then they would take those intricate patterns from their beadwork and incorporate them into the design of the houses. So beautiful.
You can really see how each tribe's architecture was tied to their environment and their culture.
Absolutely. But then the dissertation throws in this curveball, this question that I found really intriguing. It basically asks, what if indigenous South African architecture hasn't evolved much on its own? Like, what if the colonial influence, particularly from the British, has kind of held it back?
Oh, that's a provocative thought. It's like that worry about globalization, making everything look the same, wiping out those unique traditions. Have you ever noticed that in your own city? Like, are there architectural styles that just take over and you lose those little local touches?
That's something to think about. Definitely. And the dissertation actually tries to address this. It digs into some possible solutions. And one of the big ideas is this concept of abstraction and symbolism.
Okay, so how does that work in terms of architecture? What do they mean by abstraction and symbolism?
So picture this. It's like taking elements from tribal culture and then weaving those elements into modern designs, but in a more abstract way. It's not just slapping a tribal symbol on a skyscraper,
Yeah.
It's about understanding what those symbols and forms really mean and then finding a creative way to express that in a contemporary building.
So it's like capturing the spirit of the culture, not just copying it directly.
Exactly. And to break it down even further, the dissertation focuses on 4 specific elements of culture: ornamentation, systems, forms, and even stuff like clothing, arts, and crafts.
Okay, there's a lot there. Let's start with ornamentation. What would that look like in a modern building?
Well, imagine using tribal symbols and patterns, maybe even special materials, and incorporating them into the facade of a building. We could use those elements to tell stories, highlight cultural values, even just create a sense of place. Remember those amazing Ndebele wall paintings we talked about earlier? Those could be reimagined on a building's exterior.
Oh yeah, that would be incredible. Those vibrant patterns would definitely make a statement.
Totally. And then there are the systems and layouts. Think about how traditional homesteads are designed. A lot of them have a central cattle kraal.
A kettle what?
Kraal. It's an enclosure for cattle. And it's right in the center, reflecting how important cattle are to their way of life. We could actually take that idea and use it for modern urban planning. Imagine communities designed around a shared space, just like those homesteads.
That's a really cool idea. What about forms? Are they talking about using those really iconic shapes from tribal culture, like the Zulu beehive hut?
Exactly. Think about how simple but elegant that shape is. We could use that as inspiration for so many things: a rooftop garden, a community center, maybe even an art installation.
Yeah.
And don't forget the calabash, that gourd shape that's important to a lot of African cultures. Imagine a skyscraper that echoes the curves of a calabash.
I'm starting to see how these ideas could work. Now, what did you mean about using clothing and arts and crafts as inspiration?
So think about the patterns in tribal clothing, or the colors and materials used in their beadwork and pottery. Those elements could inspire the textures, patterns, even the whole visual language of a modern building.
It sounds like there's so much potential to bring these cultural elements into architecture in a really meaningful and beautiful way. But are there actual buildings in South Africa that are doing this, like real-world examples?
There are, and that's what we're going to get into next. The dissertation actually looks at a few case studies to see how these ideas are being put into practice.
Okay, I'm ready for part 2.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've seen that incorporating native culture into South African architecture is about more than just looks. It's about something much deeper. But how do we do it right? I mean, I get that it's not about just throwing a few tribal patterns on a building and calling it a day. How do we actually achieve that real, authentic integration of culture?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And the dissertation digs into that. It emphasizes how important it is to understand what's behind those traditional forms and patterns. It's about getting the essence, not just the appearance.
Right. It's not about recreating a beehive hut in downtown Pretoria. It's about understanding what made that form significant to the Zulu people. Their connection to the environment, the materials they use, the social structure it represents, and then finding a way to express all of that in a modern design.
Exactly. It's about finding a way to make those cultural elements relevant today, in the modern world. Think about those Ndebele wall paintings again. Those vibrant geometric patterns. They're more than just decoration, right?
Yeah, I remember reading about that. The colors, the patterns, even where they put the designs, it all means something. They're telling stories, showing social status, connecting people to their history. It's fascinating.
Right. So imagine taking those principles of visual communication and applying them to a modern office building. What if the facade had Ndebele-inspired patterns, not an exact copy, but a reinterpretation that says something about South African culture?
That's a really cool idea.
And it's not just about visual stuff either. Remember we were talking about how traditional homesteads often have that central cattle kraal? We could learn from those spatial arrangements and apply them to modern urban planning. You could have communities that are designed around a shared space, just like those homesteads.
That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah. And it goes back to creating a sense of belonging and connection. But okay, let's be real for a minute. We talked about how a lot of the prominent buildings in Pretoria were actually designed by firms owned by white people. So how do we make sure that Native voices are really heard when it comes to shaping South Africa's architectural identity?
Yeah, that's a huge question.
Absolutely. And the dissertation stresses how important it is to have an inclusive approach to design. It's got to involve Native communities, cultural experts, and architects from all different backgrounds working together.
So it's not about architects just borrowing from Native culture. It's about working together as partners.
Right. You want those cultures to be actively involved in the design process. And I think that would lead to some truly incredible and unique architecture.
Totally agree. And the dissertation says we need to think even bigger, not just about the buildings, but about the whole built environment, like public spaces, landscapes, infrastructure.
It's about creating cities that reflect the soul of South Africa.
Cities that celebrate their history and their diversity, that make everyone feel like they belong.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels seen and represented. Which brings us back to that question of identity, right? If architecture can help shape a nation's identity, then we need to create an architecture that reflects the real South Africa.
Okay, so we've talked about how to bring Native culture into architecture and why it matters, but now I'm thinking, why is this so important? What's at stake here?
Oh, that's a great question, and that's what we're going to tackle next. The dissertation actually looks at the bigger picture, like the social, political, even the psychological impacts of architecture. And trust me, it gets really interesting.
So we've talked about how to actually bring Native culture into South African architecture, but now I'm really curious about the why. Like, what's the big deal? What's the real impact of all of this?
Well, the dissertation goes beyond just talking about beautiful buildings. It actually connects architecture to, get this, psychology.
Oh, wow. Never thought about it like that.
Yeah, it argues that buildings and spaces can really affect how we feel about ourselves, our sense of well-being, even how we interact with other people.
That actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. We spend so much time in buildings, they must have some kind of impact on how we see the world.
Absolutely. Imagine growing up surrounded by architecture that reflects your culture, your history, the things you value, it reinforces this feeling of belonging, like you're part of something, you know?
Yeah, I get that. But what if the buildings around you feel totally foreign? Like they don't represent your culture at all. That must make you feel kind of lost, almost like you don't belong, even in your own city.
And that's a really big deal in a place like South Africa, especially after apartheid. The dissertation points out that during apartheid, European architecture was used as a way to show dominance, pushing native cultures aside and trying to impose a new identity on the landscape.
It's like a reminder that architecture isn't just about bricks and mortar, it's about power, it's about stories, and it affects people's lives in a very real way.
Exactly. And so this push for culturally influenced architecture becomes about reclaiming what was lost, about healing from the past, about building spaces that really reflect the true diversity and strength of South Africa.
I remember the dissertation even talked about architecture's role in bringing people together, right?
Yeah.
Like, could it actually help with reconciliation?
Yeah, it argues that if you incorporate elements from different native cultures into public buildings and spaces, it creates this sense of shared ownership and pride in the nation's heritage. Like, picture a public square where Zulu, Xhosa, Venda, Sotho, and Ndebele traditions are all woven together. It would be such a strong symbol of unity.
Yeah, that's a powerful image. It's like the architecture itself could help people understand each other better.
Right, and it goes beyond just symbolism, too. The dissertation highlights the practical side of things, like how traditional building techniques can be really eco-friendly, using local materials and being energy efficient.
So it's not just about looking back at the past. It's about using that wisdom to create better buildings for today.
Exactly. Traditional architecture has a lot to teach us about building in a way that's good for the environment and good for the people who use those spaces.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. We've gone from the history of South African architecture to these really deep questions about identity and belonging. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about looking at our own cities.
Oh, yeah. The challenge to really look at the buildings around us and see if they reflect our own heritage or if we're missing out on opportunities to celebrate our local traditions.
I have to admit, that's been on my mind ever since you said it.
It's a question worth pondering, that's for sure. I mean, architecture is all around us. It shapes our lives in so many ways, whether we realize it or not. And if we want cities that are really meaningful, that tell our stories and show who we are, then we need to think more carefully about the buildings we create. We can use architecture as a way to express our culture, to heal, even to protect our environment. It's a big challenge, but it's also an incredible opportunity.
Well said. This deep dive has definitely given me a whole new perspective on the power of architecture. And I hope our listeners are feeling inspired, too, to take a closer look at their own surroundings and see how buildings can be more than just shelter. They can be a reflection of who we are as a society. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you? What cool architecture have you discovered in your own explorations? Keep exploring, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.